Well, hello, everybody. This is Glenn Miller, and we're going to be talking about setting boundaries at work. And this training is focused a lot more on setting boundaries between coworkers rather than the boundaries that we typically think about in human services, which is boundaries between workers and clients. I did this training at a facility up in northern New Hampshire about a year and a half ago, and I guess they wanted to see if we could spread this knowledge around a little bit and see if we can get some other people to hear it as well. So I'm going to try to advance the screen. Doesn't seem to be advancing. Oh, I know what I got to do. There we go. Pardon me, I'm Mr. Technology. So, a boundary, and if we need to define our terms a little bit here, a limit defining you in relation to someone or something. And, in terms of setting limits and setting boundaries, we do this all the time. I draw the line here. This is my office. That's your office. This is my problem. That's your problem. This is my idea. That's your idea. Boundaries are necessary and important. They protect us. Particularly in a workplace situation, in terms of who's responsible for what belongs to somebody else, who has to solve something. It preserves our energy, both our physical and our emotional energy, and particularly I would think our emotional energy, so that we don't blend and melt into each other and become what they call enmeshed. I know a lot of you do family work, and we've all maybe dealt with enmeshed families where people don't really understand whose problems are whose, and everybody shares everything in such a way that it becomes unhealthy, and people become unable to solve problems because nobody has sole ownership of them. Setting boundaries involves knowing what your limits are, what your emotional limits are, what your physical limits are, even your spiritual limits, what makes you uncomfortable or stressed. That's your indicator. That's your signal. When something sort of triggers a feeling, you need to pay attention to that. And the three key feelings in boundary setting and boundary awareness are the feelings of just sort of discomfort, sometimes resentment, a little creeping resentment, the beginnings of resentment, and sometimes guilt. If we pay attention to those feelings, and when they pop up, think about them, analyze them, figure out where they're coming from, and we have to give ourselves permission to set boundaries. Boundary setting can be difficult at times for some people. We might not like the fact that we have to say no to somebody. We may not be completely comfortable with the fact that someone may react to our boundary setting. Now, I don't want to pick on anybody. I know that I'm talking to a lot of human service workers, and I don't want to single out any particular profession, but I think we know that people who come into human services work do so because, we love people, and we love to be involved with people, and we like to help people solve problems, and we like to bring light into dark places. And people who are drawn to this kind of work often have difficulty saying no. We often have difficulty setting limits. And sometimes that's not only the way we are at work, it's the way we are in our personal lives as well. And so I think for people in our kind of professions, we have to pay particular attention to this because it can become quite problematic in the workplace. So types of boundaries, personal boundaries, what is private? And again, particularly in a workplace, what should or should not be shared with coworkers? Let me talk about this one a little bit because I know that a lot of Easter Seals locations that we deal with are in pretty rural areas. And so my experience is that a lot of you don't just know each other from work, you know each other from town. There's a lot of sort of small towns, small area, and you know a lot about each other. And you may have worked together a long time. And this is a really important question. What is comfortable for you and what is not comfortable for you? What triggers those feelings for you in terms of, what you share and what is known about you among your coworkers? Now, there's things about physical boundaries as well. We talk a lot in our harassment training about actually the most difficult kind of harassment, sexual harassment case to defend are cases that involve touching. Any kind of unaccidental touching that happens in the workplace can make some people uncomfortable, and there's lots and lots of differences among people about this. And those differences can be based on a lot of different things, including culture. Some cultures are much more tolerant and actually have lots of expectations about touching. Other cultures are much more formal, and people become uncomfortable quicker in those cultures. So things like touching, even space, personal space, how close people stand to you. Sometimes I ask people, how often in your workplace does the workplace hug happen? How often do you embrace a coworker or get embraced by a coworker? And how comfortable are you with that? And do you have any idea how comfortable the other person might be? So my watchword on this, my sort of catchphrase on this one is, if you hug somebody at work, you have to be very certain that they want to be hugged. Sometimes a good thing happens and we hug each other. Sometimes a bad thing happens and we hug each other to offer support. But it's really important to make sure people are okay with it. We've had things in workplaces around odors, people with too much cologne, people with not enough, neatness, time management. All of those are things that affect us in the workplace. Those are considered physical boundaries, and we have a right to set those boundaries and to ask other people and really require other people to respect them. And then there's a thing called professional boundaries. What is the line? What is the demarcation between being collaborative and being independent? How do we collaborate and cooperate with our coworkers and still maintain our own sort of autonomy? And when is it okay in a workplace to say no? When is it okay not to pitch in or not to be part of something that's going on in the workplace? And these are all questions that, again, there's lots of differences among people, and my main point here is that we need to be respectful of our own right to set boundaries and other people's rights to do that as well. So functional boundaries at work. There are filters, and the first kind of filter is called filter one. We protect ourselves from other people. If you work with people who are overly critical, who are harsh communicators, how do we filter that? How do we protect ourselves from that? Learning to consider the source. Learning to filter the feedback, learning to talk to ourselves about that kind of feedback in a way that makes it less harsh and less hurtful. And sometimes we have to protect ourselves by asking people not to speak this way to us and letting people know that it's not okay. Filter two is protecting others from ourselves. And that has to do with things like what we say and how we say it, how we communicate in the workplace. Both filters are important, but and must be applied, but we can't go too much and we can't go too little. So it's a balancing act in many ways, because we often are we are required to be members of a team and to interact with other people and collaborate with other people. So these are some guidelines on that. If both filters are low, what you end up with is a volatile worker. People become hypersensitive, they're not defending themselves from others, and they're not defending others from themselves. They become defensive, and often what we get with people when these filters are both low is bullying behavior. If you only filter others but not yourself, you can also become overbearing and bullying. If you only filter yourself, you become vulnerable. And if both filters are too high, the person becomes walled off or shut down, or sort of excluded and isolated within the work group. And this is always a balancing act that we're trying to keep in place. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about much. But I think it's particularly important in human services that we model behaviors for the people that we work with. And this is a big one, the issue of codependency. And I talked a little bit earlier about enmeshment and fusing of people and people being poorly differentiated. We see this in families. We particularly see this in families where there's dysfunction, where no one knows whose problem is what. People become enmeshed. And when people become enmeshed in this fashion, they become entangled with each other. And when people get entangled like that, it becomes very difficult for either one to move forward. People become sort of stuck in the enmeshment. So people, this is an old chestnut, but there's a lot of truth to it. People will treat you the way you teach them to treat you. And what we mean by that is if somebody's treating you a certain way and you accept it or support it, then you are teaching them to treat you that way. If people treat you a way that makes you uncomfortable and you set a boundary, then you again are teaching them how to treat you. So the treatment we get is often a result of how we respond to what's going on around us and how we teach the people around us to treat us. Codependent behavior, again, particularly in a helping profession, can be very tricky to identify. And it's often disguised as helpfulness or a desire to help. I'm just trying to be helpful. I'm just trying to point this out to you. I just want you to, and the trouble starts when we buy into this identity that I'm the helpful one. I'm the one that helps people. And this is a real pitfall for people who are by nature helpers. That's what we do for a living. We help people. And when that becomes a really central part of who we are as people and our identity, it can become very tricky to identify when we are behaving in a codependent way and when we are in fact being helpful. Sometimes people when we're dealing with this kind of difficulty, become over-invested in how other people see us. Other people's opinions of us become over-important. And this is a big one. This is what codependency is all about. We lose sight of where we end and someone else begins. And these are some of the codependent roles. People become martyrs. They put other people's needs ahead of their own. It's a problem when sacrifice becomes a way of being and we neglect our own needs. I deal with this in the EAP world all the time. We get this particularly in the helping professions, nurses. There's a little thing what we used to call burnout. And burnout is when somebody gives and gives and gives and gives and doesn't do anything to replenish and doesn't do anything to protect themselves. I've had nurses referred to me. Their entire lives are about giving to other people. And they've emptied themselves out, and they don't have a way to replenish themselves. By the way, we don't call it burnout anymore. That's a passé term. There's a new terminology for that same phenomenon, and the new terminology, we call it compassion fatigue, but it's the same phenomenon. And the paradox here is that we often, when people are acting in this martyr role, we're trying to procure other people's appreciation or even their indebtedness to us, and that usually backfires. So I always think of this model of the oxygen mask in the airplane. If you've ever been on a flight, you know, when they tell you when the oxygen mask drops down, make sure you put on your own before you put on your children's. And people look at each other a little quizzically at that and, you know, wonder about how selfish that is. But if you don't take care of yourself, you can become unable to take care of other people. I remember having a conversation with a nurse one time who was in a condition of what we now call compassion fatigue. And she told me all of the people that she helped and did things for, and all of these people who depended upon her. And I expressed my admiration for that, but I said to her, I think I just want to add one name to that list, and I want to put it at the top, and that's your own name. I think you need to put yourself on top of that list. And she said to me, I think that she felt like that would be irresponsible. And my response back to that was that I thought it would be irresponsible not to put yourself on the top of the list. Because people who identify themselves as helpers and people who help for a living, it becomes absolutely essential that we find ways to protect ourselves, and that's what boundaries are all about. And if we become burned out and we suffer from compassion fatigue, we can't help anybody, and there may be lots of people who are depending upon us to do that. Another codependent role we see sometimes is the unsolicited advisor. People who feel compelled to advise and control others. And a lot of times this behavior comes out of a sense of insecurity. The one who's taking charge is just as needy, if not more so. And the dependency is actually a two-way street. Anyone who does human services work, anyone who does this sort of supportive counseling type of work, one of the best skills and one of the best ways to protect yourself is to utilize things like listening and empathy and stop with advice, particularly advice that's not solicited and not asked for. Empathy is probably the most powerful and healthy of all of the communication skills, and it's comprised of two components: being able to identify the feeling state of another person and sharing what you've identified. I can see how anxious you are. You don't have to talk the person out of being anxious. You don't have to question their anxiety. You don't have to fix it. You simply acknowledge to the person that you get how they're feeling. And that sometimes is far more valuable than advice. My sort of chestnut on this one, the thing I tell myself is that by the time people get to me, they probably already been to 20 other people for advice and it didn't work. That's why they're sitting here with me. So it's my responsibility to do something other than advice. Another codependent role is the yes person, particularly saying yes when you mean no, and then resenting it. Sure, I'll chair the committee. Sure, I'll volunteer to be the Little League coach, and then being angry that you got talked into something. It's not a real agreement, and it's dishonest. And we see passive people do this sometimes. It creates a kind of sense of we solved the problem, I took it on, but it's an artificial and temporary peace. Saying no and setting boundaries is a very essential part of teamwork. It's an essential part of relationships, too. One time I worked with a couple I worked with a guy who was in the middle of a divorce, and he said to me something sort of interesting. He said, I don't know why this is happening because we never fought. And I said, guess why this is happening? Disagreeing, getting aroused enough to care about what the other person does and thinks, and setting boundaries is an important part of any relationship. And without it, the relationship becomes shallow. There's a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin about Abraham Lincoln called The Team of Rivals. And one of the things that Abraham Lincoln did as a president was he staffed his cabinet with people who opposed him. That was a very intentional thing. He did not want his cabinet to be an echo chamber. He wanted opposing points of view. He also wanted to bring his rivals into the tent and not have them outside the tent. Lyndon Johnson did the same thing as president. When he was asked why he put a particular person in his cabinet, I'll clean up the language a little bit, but Lyndon Johnson replied, I'd rather have him inside the tent peeing out than outside the tent peeing in. So disagreeing and saying no is a necessary and important and respectful part of any relationship. Here's some signs that you might have gotten a little too close with a colleague. You have to stay late sometimes to get work done because you spend so much time interacting with your friend. Your friend goes to lunch with someone else and you feel like you've been cheated on. When other coworkers do not leave a seat next to you for your friend in a meeting, you're shocked. Your boss gets your names confused. Or you show up at a local diner for lunch and the cashier says, where's your friend? When you become, there's a fine line also between friendship and collegial relationships. And we see this a lot. How much do you want to be best buddies with your coworker? And again, in small towns, we see this will become a little more problematic. People sometimes become very closely involved with each other in a work group. But these are some signs that maybe that relationship is something you want to at least evaluate and take a look at. These are some reasons you might want to consider to not have your coworkers as really close friends. They might air your dirty laundry. They may know things about you may not want your other coworkers to know. And so there can be some real boundary violations in a work group, and we've seen these things happen. What we're sharing here with you is based on a lot of experience. Sometimes a coworker may not be as much fun outside of work as they are inside of work, or they may be too much fun. There's some lifestyle clashes and that kind of things. The tendency to become codependent, clingy, never apart. And the other thing I think that's really important, again, for human service workers, sometimes we need to get away from work. And if my best friend, the person I spend all my time with, is a coworker, you really never do get away from work. You're always, at least connected in some way to what's going on in the office. So what we talk about is coworkers need to be friendly, but should they be friends? These are business relationships. A friend today could become a foe tomorrow. The goal for a lot of people at work is to prosper, is to do well, and often to advance. And that means competition. And for some people, that competition is accomplished by any means necessary. I mean, we don't need to be paranoid about it, but this is a business environment. And the decisions are driven by business, not by personal relationships. It is necessary to have relationships at work, but it should be a business process more than it is a social process. Acting with integrity and trying to leave as much as you can, with over-emotional sorts of involvements with people, leaving that aside. Again, this is a balancing act. We do need to collaborate. We do need to form partnerships and alliances with people, but we do need to also be very much aware of where our boundaries are and where they should be. I also just want to remind people that you do have an employee assistance program. It's Coastline EAP. I'm the Director of EAP Services. My name is Glenn Miller. You can call us anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you do give us a call, whether it's a workplace problem or a personal problem, it is completely confidential. And whenever you call, you will be talking to a master's level clinician within a minute or two. I also want to put this out there because this sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, but the service is not only available to you as employees, it's also available to any member of your family. And please notice that I did not say household. It can be any member of your family, your aunt, your uncle, your ex-spouse, whoever it is. If you give them our phone number and they call us and say, listen, my uncle works at Easter Seals, that's good enough for us, we'll work with them. So I just want to remind people you have that service. We are certainly available for consultation around workplace issues and workplace problems, and that's kind of something that my staff here is kind of specializes in, is helping people navigate what can sometimes be pretty complex issues in the workplace. So at this point, I have no idea how to do the technology, but I'm going to have my friend here kind of open this up for questions. And I think we're all unmuted. So does anybody have any questions at this point?
I don't think so. Can you hear us?
All right, I'm not hearing any. Again, see that phone number. There may be a question you don't want to ask in front of other people. So again, please utilize that 800 phone number. Give us a call anytime. If there's a question you want to ask in a more private way, that's the way to do it. I want to thank you all for attending the training today. I hope it was helpful. I hope it gets you thinking about some things. And I look forward to talking to you all again sometime. Thanks so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.